的讲座题目是关于汉娜·阿伦特，然后因为我不是一个政治哲学家哈，所以说我对这个领域的了解也不多哈，我也希望能在这场讲座之中能学到更多的东西。然后呢，我用一个英文做一个介绍哈，然后我们就是请John上来讲，因为时间也不多了哈。OK. So it's already. So good afternoon, everyone. It's my great honor to introduce Professor John Keane to the audience today. John is co-founder of the Sydney Democracy Network and professor of politics at the University of Sydney. His current research interests include China, the Asia-Pacific region, and the future of global institutions, and the 21st century enemies of democracy. So during his many years of residence in Britain, the Times of London newspaper ranked him as one of the world's leading political thinkers and writers in our time. So today his lecture is on Hannah Arendt and her famed book, The Human Condition. Arendt was convinced by her analysis of totalitarianism that many in the modern world were eager to abdicate their civic freedom and responsibility, thereby relieving themselves of the burden of independent action and judgment. In the celebrated chapter on action in the book, she emphasized the frailty, boundlessness, and unpredictability of political action. This emphasis on the contingency of political action may strengthen our sense that politics is an unpleasant burden, one taken up only by hyper-responsible individuals. Yet Arendt celebrated this very contingency, seeing it as an authentic expression of the tangible freedom the actor experiences when he or she initiates a new and unpredictable sequence of events in the public realm. So in this book, Hannah Arendt aimed at providing a philosophical account of the meaning of political action in the total economy of human existence. We look forward to learning more on this fine book from John today. So I hand you the podium, John. Thank you.
And I wanted to say that, yeah, I think it's still 早上好, and I also wanted to say 谢谢来参加. Thank you very much for coming today. You will know, friends and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, that this 4-part series of lectures on the concept of 政治 and 政治生活, political life and politics, is based on 4 classic books. And for those of you who didn't come on Monday, you missed a very fine lecture. I want to just say something about what happened in the first lecture. When you may know, if you were at the lecture, I forgot to use my PowerPoint. I was so excited and nervous. So I just want to remind you of lecture 1, which was about Carl Schmitt, one of the great political thinkers and constitutional thinkers in Germany in the first half of the 20th century, the crown jurist of the Third Reich, as he's called. We looked at several of the core themes in his work. His critique of liberalism, his thesis that a crisis of liberalism, a spiritual crisis of liberalism, is happening in the 1920s. That the key reason for this spiritual crisis is the advance of Minchu, democracy, by which he understood the advancement of social forces that demand not only the right to vote, but the right to a job, the right to social security through the state. And according to Schmitt, this leads to the development of what he called the Totalstaat, the total state. That is a very strong state whose job is not only policing and military defense of the state, and the population that lives inside a territory, but a state that also takes on many social functions, a kind of welfare state that deals with class conflict, trade unions, social democratic parties, by integrating those social forces into the state. And according to Schmitt, it's this growth of the total state that, as it were, puts on the table, it reminds us of the fundamental and unavoidable importance of the political in human life. What is the political? You will recall from that lecture that Schmitt thinks that we human beings, for all of our niceness, for all of our civility, for all of our friendship, have the capacity to be evil, to be wolfish, to be acquisitive, to be egoistic. And it is exactly that trait of human nature that means that in the human condition there is the ever-present possibility of friends and foes, that division between foes and friends, between enemies and friends, developing. And that, for Schmitt, you'll recall from the lecture, is the quintessence of politics. It's the essential feature of politics, that politics is a process whereby enemies are defined and friends are constructed to protect people against their enemies. And this happens inside states, so that the function, the key function of states in these years of the early 20th century, says Schmitt, is that the state protects its population from enemies, enemies at home, and enemies abroad. And it expects the population of those states to be obedient. This is the famous protection obedience principle in Carl Schmitt. And of course, he quotes from Thomas Hobbes, and he is often called, as we discussed on Monday, he is often called the Thomas Hobbes of the early years of the 20th century. This leads Schmitt, just to carry on with this summary, to the idea of a state of emergency. What happens, we can say, if a state begins to crumble, that it begins to get caught up in deep antagonisms, with the danger of civil war at home or military invasion from abroad? It's under those circumstances, says Schmitt, that the assertion of sovereignty is of fundamental importance. The protection of the state, because the function of the state is to protect the population from violence. And this is a very famous definition. Sovereign is he. It could be also she, who decides on the exception, meaning in a crisis, someone, to protect the state, to protect the political order, has to take a decision. And this is usually not something that a parliament can do. The people cannot do it. Usually a small group can only do that. And that assertion of sovereignty, we could say, is thoroughly undemocratic. That is the way in which states protect themselves. And this finally led us to talk about Schmitt's theory of dictatorship, two kinds of dictatorship. One of them, the Bolshevik kind, he called sovereign dictatorship. The language is a bit confusing, but the idea is that there are dictatorships by small groups who transform the political order. They're revolutionary. They change the constitution, they change the structures of the state to build a new political order. That's a sovereign dictatorship. And Schmitt understands and feels quite, so to say, comfortable with that, although he is, on balance, a defender of what he called commissarial dictatorship, of the kind that was asserted at the end of the Weimar Republic in Germany and at the beginning of the Nazi dictatorship. Commissarial dictatorship is when the police and the army and executive power crush the opponents of the state in order to preserve the status quo. So this, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, was a brief summary, if you missed it, of my opening lecture on Carl Schmitt. And today, I want to cause some confusion, probably, by switching to an entirely different understanding of the concept of 政治, of politics. And I want to talk about Hannah Arendt, and I want to talk about this book, The Human Condition, which is considered to be one of her greatest works. Probably that book, published in the late 1950s, and The Origins of Totalitarianism, published in the early 1950s, are usually considered to be her key works. Born in 1906, died in New York City, born in Hanover, near Hanover in Germany, died in New York City in 1975. You may know that she is one of those rare political thinkers who becomes famous. You may know that an asteroid in outer space is named after her. I have never seen it, but it's asteroid 1027, and it's called Hannah Arendt. There is a train in Germany called the Hannah Arendt Express. If you go to Berlin, there is Hannah Arendt Straße, which is a street that adjoins this remarkable abstract modern or postmodern monument, huge monument to the murdered Jews of Europe. Hannah Arendt Straße is there. There are Hannah Arendt prizes. There's the Hannah Arendt Center at the New School for Social Research. And recently, 2012, I don't know if it was released in China, but there is a film called Hannah Arendt, which I urge you to have a look at. It's about her reporting for the New Yorker magazine of the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. A report that she wrote for the New Yorker magazine that caused a great controversy, especially among the Jewish community, because of not only her documenting of evidence of Jewish collaboration with the Nazis, but the really shocking thing about Eichmann in Jerusalem is that, according to her, Eichmann was actually a normal guy. You know, he was certified by a dozen psychiatrists as normal. He swore that he didn't hate Jews. He was a former salesman of the vacuum oil company. He said he never read anything but newspapers. He was kind of a cuddly uncle. Probably you have relatives like him. And of course he was responsible for administering the final solution, which murdered at least 6 million Jews and many other groups as well. And Hannah Arendt tried to capture that in this wonderful work called Eichmann in Jerusalem. And this film is about that experience. Hannah Arendt, I think, in order to understand the human condition and her unusual understanding of 政治, you have to understand the tremendous impact on her thinking that the experience of totalitarianism had on her. When she uses that category, she doesn't speak about Japan, she speaks about Stalinism, and she speaks about Nazism. Already that was controversial. But according to her, the world had never seen before a political order or political disorder and chaos and violence on this scale ever. Not only that, but the logic of totalitarianism was entirely unfamiliar to us. And according to her, it's that unfamiliarity that forces us, or should force those who are interested in political thinking, to think again, to think with fresh eyes and ears and minds. And as she put it in a very often quoted expression, We are now confronted with the task of thinking without a banister. You know, a banister is the rail when you are going downstairs that you hold as you're going downstairs. So, according to Arendt, what's now required is that we have no secure guidelines for how to think. We have to think in fresh ways, and her conception of the political, you will see, is an expression of that. This is the first point. Thinking without a banister after the experience of totalitarianism, which for Arendt is not over. It can happen again. And indeed, during the McCarthyism years in the United States, she worried, in a number of essays, she worried that that experience of totalitarianism could happen also in the United States. So her whole political thinking is haunted by the experience of totalitarianism, and she tries to think in fresh ways about that experience and about modernity. Modernity, you will see in Arendt's work, is not, the picture is not very pretty. There is a kind of anti-modernism that runs through her work. Why? Because according to Arendt, the modern world, which she roughly dates from the beginning of the 17th century until today, modernity is marked by certain tendencies that all of which push towards the destruction of politics. Here there's a parallel with Carl Schmitt, because you know that Carl Schmitt was convinced that liberalism was the culprit, that liberalism was responsible for depoliticizing life, of thinking that life could be about money and talk. And of course he's a strong critic of this. Hannah Arendt has a similar critique, although the content of the critique is different. Why the destruction of politics under modern conditions? She lists a number of forces. Christianity, the tremendous grip on Europe of Christianity, and of course North America, and of course Spanish America. Why Christianity? Because Christianity preaches, in her view, that life on earth is relatively unimportant by comparison with the future, heaven. And that Christians should prepare themselves on earth either by being saved by the Catholic Church or through their good works if they are Protestant. Christians should pay attention to their lives in preparation for the afterlife. And this render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, a famous sentence from the Bible. This leads to actually Christianity helping to destroy politics in her view. The spread of bureaucracy is another force that is responsible for the depoliticization of modernity. And here, this is Max Weber's thesis, that the spread of bureaucracy is one of the organizing principles, if not the organizing principle of modernity. I've mentioned totalitarianism. If you read her Origins of Totalitarianism, which is translated into Chinese, I understand, you will find that for her, totalitarianism is a system of power and decision-making and violence that totally destroys politics. I've still not defined what she means by politics, but that is the case. And then she wants to say that the modern world is preoccupied with labor, holding down a job in a factory in order to buy a BMW or a Volkswagen, and living in your family and paying no attention to the public realm and politics. Modernity is actually a recipe for homogeneity. People become the same through consumption, through their reduction to laborers, for example, in a factory or an office. And they become conformists. I mean, it's a very bleak picture. I think it's actually inaccurate. But one can understand, writing in the 1950s, why Hannah Arendt adopted, she embraced what was at that time called mass society theory. There was a great fear that modernity, that totalitarianism was not a traffic accident on the highway of modern progress, but that totalitarianism tells us much about the very dynamics, the structures and dynamics, the ethos of modernity. So totalitarianism requires conformity, it requires homogeneity of people. She goes on to say that there are other forces at work in modernity. It's a very bleak picture. Earth alienation. If you read this book, you will find the opening pages are about the successful space launch, and that leads eventually to the landing of men on the moon. And she says, this tells us that actually the modern world is alienated from the Earth. I mean, our fantasy is to go and live on another planet. And this is an anti-political sentiment. World alienation is a concept that is confusing, but what, in a sentence, she means by this, a feature of modernity, is the destruction of common sense, the destruction of commonly shared public norms and institutions. There's a kind of privatization that goes on under modern conditions, and it leads to mass society. Now, what is to be done about this? One of the features of Hannah Arendt's political thinking that's important to understand is the way that she looks backwards. To put it crudely, modernity is a lost cause. Modernity contains nothing, very little of value. So, in order to recover a sense of politics that is very different than the sense of politics of Carl Schmitt, her technique, her methodology, is to look over her shoulder backwards at the Roman Republic and the early Greek democracies. What she wants to say is that the past can be retrieved. There are things in the past that they resemble pearls. And at one point she says that what she's engaged in is kind of pearl diving. You know, she's diving deeply into the waters of the past in order to recover these beautiful thoughts, these beautiful principles that have been destroyed by modernity. And here she is under the influence of her teacher, Martin Heidegger. She met Walter Benjamin in Paris when she was fleeing from Germany with the rise of the Nazis. And these influences encouraged her to look for what she called the forgotten treasure, the lost or the forgotten treasure of the past. I mean, you know this principle in Zhongguo because in Zhongguo today there is a very big push, as I understand it, to recover a sense of the depth and the greatness of ancient Chinese civilization. There's a kind of hermeneutics of recovering the past in order to bring it back to life, so to say, in the present, to guarantee a good future. The same kind of strategy you can find in Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition. Notice that she is not an antiquarian. She's not interested in the past because she likes collecting, you know, old things. Old jewelry, old pottery, you know, old photographs. This is not what she is doing. She wants to say that the past contains beautiful treasures that we must not allow to slip away from us, to permanently forget. And this leads her to a theory of action, a theory of politics, as we'll see, that counts as a second understanding of politics and puts her at considerable distance and in great tension with Carl Schmitt. How does she do it? Well, her concept of action is outlined in this book at length. It's not an easy book to read, but if you read nothing else, you should have a look at the long section about action. What she wants to say is that we human beings engage in three types of activity, three types of action. One is labor, what she calls labor. Labor is, for example, working in a factory on a production line, producing, let's say, packaged foods that are sold in a supermarket. According to her, labor is a type of activity that is necessary for human life to reproduce itself. Without food, we are nothing. There's a second type of activity which she calls work. Werk is the German word. When we refer in English and in other European languages to work, it has a complicated meaning, but for example, we speak about a work of art, a great work of art. What is work? Work is, for example, a craftsman who makes a beautiful chair which survives through time, is very useful to sit on in a living room, and where the craftsman takes pride in his or her work that he or she has fabricated. This, says Hannah Arendt, this type of activity is being crushed by modern capitalist industrial bureaucracy. She has, in this book, though she doesn't put it like this, something of a picture of work being reduced to what Charlie Chaplin made fun of. You know, if you look at his Modern Times film, how many of you have seen Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times? Yeah, a few of you. Have a look at it. You will find it on Baidu.com, I'm sure. It's a picture of a worker who's reduced to like a machine. And there's nothing very creative about his or her work. Well, according to Arendt, work is destroyed by modernity. Modernity makes a fetish of, it universalizes the experience of labor. And the cost of this is great. The cost is high because what it does is destroy action. Action in the sense of public speech and action that involves joining with others to decide how they are going to live together on earth. I'll say more about it in a moment, but this is her understanding of politics. Politics is a process where individuals join together as citizens, as gongin, who then use words and take decisions together to decide how they will live on earth and how they will live better, how they can improve their lives. According to Arendt, the concept of human nature should be set aside. She says, I think correctly, that when we talk about human nature, we suppose that we're gods. You know, if Carl Schmitt says human nature is potentially violent and evil, she says you'd have to be a god to be able to say that, because human beings change through time and space. At one point, she says in The Human Condition, to make statements about human nature requires jumping over our shadows. Try it sometime. It's very difficult. Jump over your shadow. So she doesn't like the category of human nature because she wants to say that human beings living in the world, that being in the world is constant self-transformation through labor, through work, and through politics. What I'm going to do now is speak only about politics. What is politics? Well, according to Arendt, politics is not a means to an end. It's not something we have to do in order to achieve higher goals in life. Politics is an end in itself. It's a type of activity that is not just about life, Carl Schmitt, it's about the good life. Politics and the good life are twins. when people gather together in public and they discuss and argue and disagree and agree and reach compromises and so on, this act of politics is always about, according to Arendt, it's always about how do we want to live our lives? Can we improve our lives? And in this sense, she says, lots of political thinking has actually missed that point. You know, the belief that government, the role of government is merely to protect private property. This is anti-political thinking. And she's, as you will see in this book, she's strongly critical of Hobbes, because Hobbes' understanding of politics is that politics is the art of a strong state protecting individuals who are prone to fall into civil war. This is a miserable understanding of the human condition, and it ignores, according to Arendt, the possibility of politics as the production of visions of a better life. She's also strongly critical of Karl Marx for this reason. She thinks that, we should discuss it, but she thinks that Marx's political thinking is actually anti-political thinking. That what Marx envisions is a future communist society where there's no politics anymore. I mean, the young Marx would say we hunt in the morning and we fish in the afternoon, and we ballroom dance and we have good dinners. But notice that there's no public discussion and there's no politics. According to Arendt, Marx is a part of the problem and not the solution. She wants to say that when we engage with others publicly, when we become political, it is a way of actually living freely as equals. What she wants to say, it's a very profound point, I think, is that when people become involved in a group situation and consider each other as equals and set about trying to decide how to reach a decision about how they are going to live in the future together, then the very act of joining in is the capacity to begin. Beginning is very important for Hannah Arendt. And notice that the struggle for freedom and equality through politics, according to her, is a non-violent act. Violence is the enemy of politics. And here we have a very big gap between Carl Schmitt and Hannah Arendt. For Carl Schmitt, violence is inherent in the political. For Hannah Arendt, violence is its opposite. Why? Because violence, as she says, is not only the destruction of someone's life, the taking away of life in the extreme act, a murder, a rape, but violence is also the taking away of speech and the capacity for action. There have been writers, and in my own book on violence, I have likened an act of violence to drowning underwater. You know, some of you may have had the experience of being violated. When someone pulls a gun, and when someone threatens to use it, or someone uses it, it's as if you drown. You can't speak anymore. You're petrified by fear. You lose your capacity for action. So violence is deeply anti-political. And she wants to say that, it's a very interesting idea, that when people join together with others as equals and begin to act and find their freedom in and through their cooperation with others, then this is a kind of rebirth. It's a kind of rebirth, natality. It's perhaps for you a strange idea, but we are reborn by being political. during the question and answer period, I hope we can talk about whether any of you have had this experience. But I can tell you that I have had political experiences where I understand that this point of Hannah Arendt is profound. That when you join with others in some kind of group setting, you're actually changed. And you feel a different person. You feel as though there's been a new birth. And what she wants to say is, here she's against Carl Schmitt, who's very mocking of words. Remember in the first lecture, Carl Schmitt thinks that liberals, you can always spot a liberal because they always think that words can resolve everything. You know, talk, 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 talk. And Hannah Arendt says, no, this sarcastic, negative understanding of words forgets that words are central to politics. That it's through speech and interaction with others that we find ourselves and we have the capacity to become free as equals. That is, through politics. And in this respect, when a baby is born, Hannah Arendt says, is the promise of politics. May I ask, how many of you have ever been present at the birth of a child? Of your own? or men, have you ever been present at the birth of a child? Has anybody in the room? Nobody. Wow. Try it sometime. I have to say that I was present at the birth of both of my children. And it's a terrifying experience. But it's amazing. And in the case of my firstborn, the first thing that happened is not only that, my child, how can we say, urinated all over the place, went to the toilet as soon as he came into the world, but let out a shriek, a cry, words, wanting to join the world. This is a very Arendt experience. That's natality. That's the birth of a child who in their first words expresses the possibility, which she thinks every human being has, the possibility of becoming political. And it's through words and joining together with others and acting together that is promised in the birth of a child. She points out that politics requires courage. To become political requires courage. I don't know whether, again, any of you have ever had this experience, but I'm not going to tell you the terrible details, but I can tell you the first time I ever stood up at a political meeting and said something and was booed by much of the crowd. To stand up in front of other people requires guts. It requires courage. You have to take a big deep breath, and it's a risk. Hannah Arendt says that courage is essential for understanding what happens in politics itself. This leads Hannah Arendt to a very unusual, one could say quite radical understanding of power. Let me backtrack. If you ask Carl Schmitt what is power, Carl Schmitt will say that the sovereign power, for instance, is a group of people who are well armed and are prepared to use that violence. Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Arendt says this is not power at all. This is a misunderstanding. This is force. Force is a type of activity backed by guns, threatening to take someone's life away. For example, in war or in civil war, or in a violent robbery, or in a rape. This is not politics and this is not power. What she wants to say is that power is a very chuanli, is a very precious category. That power comes from people joining together to speak and interact. It's that banding together that makes those people feel that actually they can change the world, and they can change, certainly, their own lives, that they can change institutional structures. Now, this you may think is, it's a sort of very abstract idea. Here is an image from 1 month ago in Yerevan, in Armenia. You know from global news that situations like this develop. This is the leader of the opposition in Armenia. This crowd, and the crowds that developed during the course of a number of weeks, called on the government to resign because of corruption. And eventually, this public succeeded. The government was forced to resign. We call it in English people power. And that's exactly Arendt's idea. That people, when they come together, and when they act politically, have tremendous shaping power on the world. It is an experience for which we should reserve the category of power. Power is not force, power is not manipulation, power is the coming together of people in public settings. Hannah Arendt was interested and wrote quite a lot on cases of people power. Revolutions are examples. You know, she wrote about the French Revolution, the American Revolution. She was very attached to the American Revolution. She thought it was a kind of pure revolution, where people, the American colonists, decided that they'd had enough of the British and that they were going to declare independence. So they write a Declaration of Independence, and then they begin, a group begins to draft a new constitution. And it's relatively unviolent. It's a type of public action that undermined an empire. And this is the point of Hannah Arendt. If you think that power is a set of resources that leaders have in institutions, forget it. Power always comes from below. Power always, it takes the form of people consenting to existing institutions. And the test of this is the moment where people withdraw their consent and they begin to act as a public independently of those institutions. And according to Arendt, what often happens, not always, what often happens is that those institutions collapse. That's what a revolution is. And the example from Armenia is a case in point. The Russian Revolution, the French resistance to Hitler during Second World War. She wrote also about the Hungarian uprising against the Soviet Union, 1956, where for 11 days, Hungarian citizens actually managed to paralyze the Soviet Empire. She could have added Solidarność in Poland, 1980-81, where an independent trade union is formed in Gdansk. And that is the beginning of the end of the Bolshevik Revolution, at least in Europe. She wants to say that power, the power of people gathered as equals, finding their freedom, is tremendously powerful. And she also wants to say that that politics, in this sense, can be fun. Joy is a word that she uses quite often to describe the experience of politics. And if you haven't had this experience, it's hard to convey this point. But you know, there are moments in a public space where people are acting together to make some demand, where there is tremendous sense of joy at what is going on. You know, it's the moment where the dictator falls. There are very many good accounts, for example, of the Iranian Revolution, where exactly this happens, where the news reaches the crowds in many cities that the Shah is giving up. And people are just ecstatic. They kiss, they hug, they feel that they are immortal. They feel that they can almost not breathe. This Arendt tries to capture. She wants to say, these are still qualities of politics. She wants to say, and I'll go through these briefly, she wants to say that it's through politics that plurality flourishes. What she means by this is that each individual who joins in a public space and through words and deeds acts politically, brings a certain individuality, a certain difference to that public space. That is, politics is a process of pluralization of identities. People discover that they're not the same, that everybody's different. This is a very basic Arendtian principle, by the way. You know, she was a great champion of the view that the human condition is very complex and plural. Heterogeneity is what it is to be human, not similarity. And she wants to say as well, disclosure, that what happens when you enter into a public space, when you become political, is that you disclose who you are. When you stand up in front of a crowd and you say, my name is John Keane, and I am concerned about this and this, and I have children, and I have, a dog, and I have, I'm revealing things about myself to others. And someone else stands up and gives a speech where they say, well, my name is, my name is Anne Smith, and I'm a mother of 5 children, and I am concerned about this. So through that process, there is a disclosure of not what we are, but who we are, according to Arendt. She has an understanding of politics as very fragile. She says publics can disappear very quickly. People leave the streets, people go back to their lives, and suddenly there's no more politics. It can disappear within minutes, within hours, within days. And so, in general, her view is that we human beings do have the capacity for politics, but this capacity for politics has to be renewed. It can be lost. According to her, one of the fruits of politics is remembering. Memory is very important. So when a group of people act politically, they bring memories from the past. They keep alive traditions. And these memories are very important for guiding people to think about the future. She says at one point that think about politics as an attempt to become immortal. I mean, we human beings, each of us die. Each of us in this room will die. There's no known cure for it. Death, that is. But it's through politics that, in a way, we keep a community alive. We remember our ancestors. We act together in concert through words and deeds. And in this way, we kind of give ourselves a sense of immortality. She would say, for instance, that the American revolutionaries handed gifts to the future Americans who had not yet been born. This was a kind of a giving of immortality to people, enabling them to live their lives thanks to those who came before them. Fragility I've already mentioned. Politics can be easily destroyed. It can be destroyed, for example, by a military coup d'etat. The tanks can come in, guns can fire, and that's the end of politics. She also says and these are important points, that one of the striking things about politics, as I've been describing it, is that built into it is uncertainty or an unpredictability. We can never be sure, when we take decisions in public, we can never be sure what the consequences will be. Only a God could know that. Therefore, built into politics is uncertainty about what we're doing and whether we're taking the right decision. Politics is risky. Politics is joining together. At one point, she likens it to gathering around a table. You know, the table joins us together and keeps us apart. It's a strange collective experience, plurality and so on. But that very joining together contains within it unpredictability and uncertainty about outcomes. And therefore, she is very interested in the human condition with these two types of action, forgiving and promising. Here, I think, is Hannah Arendt's reply to Carl Schmitt's view that people are nasty creatures who are prone to violence and evil and manipulation, and that therefore strong rule, political rule, is the only way in which order can be maintained, the protection of life and the condition of obedience. What Arendt says is that no, actually through politics, things that were done that resulted in injustices can be forgiven. Politics is about forgiveness. For instance, you know, during the transition from apartheid in South Africa to the new government of the South African National Congress, Nelson Mandela, led by Nelson Mandela, you may know that there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission set up. This was a very special process where many tens of thousands of South Africans actually came to this commission and said sorry, or asked for forgiveness. That, says Arendt, is what happens in politics. I mean, obviously this is idealized. You know, she has a norm of politics, but good politics, when it really functions well, involves people asking for forgiveness and giving forgiveness at things that went wrong. An example, it seems to happen less these days, but it's when, I know, Harvey Weinstein, #MeToo. You may know that just in the past few days, he handed himself in to the New York police. He's guilty, and he will go to jail for sexual harassment and violation of women. That, says Arendt, is what politics is about. It's saying sorry. It's acknowledging that I did wrong, and I'm asking for forgiveness. And this, for Arendt, is a kind of has civilizing effects. So Schmitt doesn't consider this, but should. And then promising. What is promising? In politics, says Arendt, we make promises. We make promises to keep our promises. What is she actually talking about? Agreements. You know, we have a Paris climate agreement. We have trade agreements. There's a certain president at the moment who doesn't like promising. You may have noticed, otherwise known as Donald Trump. But politics is the art of making promises, to stick to promises. And that, both forgiving and promising, are ways of overcoming the unpredictability of politics. By promising to agree to carry on to follow rules builds an element of certainty into politics, and it means that the future is, in that sense, somehow more predictable. I'm almost finished, and I'm sorry if I've given you a headache about this, but I'm looking forward, as last Monday, to the Q&A. I want to say two remaining things just to round out Arendt's understanding of politics. I don't know in Chinese the word for judgment, making a judgment. What would it be? Oh, so I better explain what a judgment is. According to Arendt, there are no universal rules in political life. Rules change through time and space. How we should act is always dependent on a context. People will say, there is a God, and that God has said this, and others will say, no, I don't believe. Making a judgment is reaching a decision on the basis of having no fixed universal rules. To put it very simply, judgment involves forming opinions and taking a decision which is thought to be the best decision at this point in time and space. That is a judgment. No universals, only particulars. So judgments are always complex, challenging. They make people lose sleep in their beds at night. Did I decide the right thing? Did we decide the right thing? I don't know. A judgment is reaching a decision, taking a decision on the basis of deep uncertainty about whether it's right or not. What would be the Chinese word for judgment?
It's quite like compromise, right?
No, it's taking a decision without knowing whether it's right or wrong. But you have to take a decision. Judgment.
判断
判断. Maybe 判断. And one last thing about politics. Arendt, in several passages, says that 真相, truth, is a tyrant, a despot. And I need to explain this. What happens when people join together politically as equals and find their freedom, and they take decisions about how they want to live the good life, and they do so non-violently, and they find themselves differentiating themselves, they discover pluralism and so on, and it takes courage and so on. What happens in that context? Are they finding the truth? 真相? She says not at all. Actually, talk of truth is the enemy of politics. Why? Because when someone says, I know the truth, they are behaving like a monarch, they are behaving like a tyrant, they are behaving like a dictator. I know, and I'm not compromising, I know I'm right. You must have friends who do this, or maybe you do this sometimes. She says that ideally, politics is only about opinion. And what she means is that all opinions are important. It's difficult to decide what is right and what is wrong. But truth should have no place in the hard sense of 真相. Truth should not have its home in politics, that it should be kept out of politics. Politics is about interpretation. Politics is about opinion making. Politics is about making judgments. Whether they're right or wrong, in 100 years from now, people will say, that's very strange, they decided this. That's the point, that politics is about opinions, and it is about our collective efforts to live life on the basis of opinions. She does say that it's complicated, but Zhang is what happens in science and engineering, so on, but it doesn't happen in politics. I think, friends and colleagues and ladies and gentlemen, I think it's enough on Hannah Arendt and her conception of politics. You can see that in this second lecture, we have moved a long way away from Carl Schmitt. If you're confused at this point about Western conceptions of Zhang Zhi, that's good. I'm deliberately trying to confuse you because you will see that there isn't an agreement in the West about the meaning of politics, but please come to lectures 3 and 4 because I'm going to try to draw it together, and you will find there are some interesting insights from bringing these 4 together. But, thank you very much.